Hello and welcome to the DebtCircle Sundown brief for the 17th of August 2026. Here are the key developments across corporate bonds, mutual funds, FPI debt investments, money markets, government securities, liquidity, currencies, commodities, indices, and primary corporate bond issuances. Top 5 highest yield listed corporate bonds. Starting with the top 5 highest yield listed corporate bonds. Monado Financial Services Private Limited recorded a yield of 17.00% with a trade value of 41.00 lakh rupees. Regency FinCorp Limited recorded a yield of 16.00% with a trade value of 26.50 lakh rupees. Monado Financial Services Private Limited also recorded a yield of 15.50% with a trade value of 1.00 lakh rupees. Kirtana Finserv Limited recorded a yield of 15.00% with a trade value of 0.14 lakh rupees. And Midland Microfin Limited recorded a yield of 15.00% with a trade value of 3.80 lakh rupees. Top 5 highest yield unlisted corporate bonds. Moving to the top 5 highest yield unlisted corporate bonds. FDPL Finance Private Limited recorded a yield of 16.00% with a trade value of 12.00 lakh rupees. Advanced Performance Materials Private Limited recorded a yield of 15.24% with a trade value of 3.00 lakh rupees. Reliance Capital Limited recorded a yield of 15.00% with a trade value of 500.00 lakh rupees. Refine Finance Private Limited recorded a yield of 14.10% with a trade value of 38.00 lakh rupees. And Apex Homes Private Limited recorded a yield of 14.00% with a trade value of 1919.17 lakh rupees. Mutual fund debt transactions. Now, looking at mutual fund debt transactions. Gross purchases stood at 21,341.47 crore rupees. Gross sales stood at 15,387.79 crore rupees. Net investment stood at 5,953.68 crore rupees. For August month to date, net investment stood at minus 31,442.190 crore rupees. FPI debt market investment. Moving to FPI debt market investment. Under the general limit, gross purchases stood at 551.85 crore rupees. Under VRR, gross purchases stood at 796.13 crore rupees. Under FAR, gross purchases stood at 1059.89 crore rupees. Now, gross sales. Under the general limit, gross sales stood at 1,279.40 crore rupees. Under VRR, gross sales stood at 367.53 crore rupees. Under FAR, gross sales stood at 597.35 crore rupees. Looking at net investment, the general limit recorded minus 727.55 crore rupees. VRR recorded net investment of 428.60 crore rupees and FAR recorded net investment of 462.54 crore rupees. For August month to date, net investment under the general limit stood at minus 658.84 crore rupees. Under VRR, August month to date net investment stood at minus 952.87 crore rupees. Under FAR, August month to date net investment stood at 1,434.78 crore rupees. Looking at 2026 year to date, on a calendar year basis, net investment under the general limit stood at 55,778 crore rupees. Under VRR, it stood at minus 14,243 crore rupees. And under FAR, it stood at 40,733 crore rupees. Money market rates. Now let's look at money market rates. The call rate stood at 5.18%. The T-repo rate stood at 5.02%. The basket repo rate stood at 5.12%. And the special repo rate stood at 4.95%. India government bond yields. Moving to India government bond yields. The 1-year yield stood at 5.80%. The 3-year yield stood at 6.22%. The 5-year yield stood at 6.43%. The 7-year yield stood at 6.64%. The 9-year yield stood at 6.79%. The 10-year yield stood at 6.81%. The 15-year yield stood at 7.00%. And the 30-year yield stood at 7.41%. T-bill yield and auction cutoff. Looking at T-bill yields and auction cutoffs. The 91-day yield stood at 5.26%, the 182-day yield stood at 5.54%, and the 364-day yield stood at 5.71%. Liquidity indicators. Coming to liquidity indicators. Net liquidity injected stood at minus 195,176 crore rupees. The SDF stood at 195,685 crore rupees and the MSF stood at 509 crore rupees. MIBOR OIS rates. Moving to MIBOR OIS rates, the 1-year rate stood at 5.78%, the 2-year rate stood at 5.99%, the 3-year rate stood at 6.13%, and the 5-year rate stood at 6.32%. Modified MIFOR rates. For modified MIFOR rates, the 2-year rate stood at 6.84%, the 3-year rate stood at 6.88%, the 4-year rate stood at 6.97%, and the 5-year rate stood at 7.02%. Currency rates. Now let's look at currency rates. The US dollar to Indian rupee rate stood at 95.61 rupees, compared with 95.60 rupees previously. The euro to Indian rupee rate stood at 110.83 rupees, compared with 110.61 rupees previously. The British pound to Indian rupee rate stood at 129.62 rupees, compared with 129.38 rupees previously. The Japanese yen to Indian rupee rate stood at 0.60 rupees, unchanged from 0.60 rupees previously. And the Chinese yuan to Indian rupee rate stood at 14.18 rupees, compared with 14.15 rupees previously. Commodities and indices. Moving to commodities and indices. 24-karat gold with 99.9% purity stood at 15,566 rupees per 10 grams, compared with 15,513 rupees per 10 grams previously. Silver stood at 2,500 rupees per 10 grams, unchanged from 2,500 rupees per 10 grams previously. Crude oil stood at 88.79 US dollars, compared with 88.36 US dollars previously. The Sensex closed at 77,728.16, compared with 78,009.25 previously. And the Nifty stood at 24,287.65, compared with 24,366.00 previously. India primary issuance, corporate bonds. Finally, let's look at India's primary issuance of corporate bonds. Kotak Mahindra Prime Limited issued 400 crore rupees with a tenure of 39 months and a coupon of 7.88%. The rating information provided is dash. Sundaram Home Finance Limited issued 300 crore rupees with a tenure of 61 months and a coupon of 7.81%. The ratings provided are CRISIL Ratings Limited, AAA, and ICRA Limited, AAA. That brings us to the end of today's DebtCircle Sundown brief. Stay tuned to DebtCircle for more updates and insights from India's debt and fixed income markets. Thank you for watching and have a great evening.